Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Very pleased to be here. And on behalf of the Maynard Institute, thanks to INN, thank you, Fran, for this opportunity. Thank you, Sue, and all the team, Sarah, for being so wonderful. And congratulations for being able to put this on. I know it was a Herculean effort. And so congratulations to you to getting to this point. Like the nation, journalism is really at an inflection point. And it's important to point out that the killing of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Rayshard Brooks in Atlanta over the weekend, and the seemingly endless list of Black men and women and people of color has continued to lay bare the deep racism and white supremacy and health and wealth disparities of our nation. This at a time when many newsrooms themselves are in crisis. Some of this crisis is financial, but there are two other crises of our own making that we face as a profession: a deep distrust and a systemic lack of equity and inclusion. As you can see here, so much of the issues going on around diversity and things happening in newsrooms. And I would argue to say that at this moment, the soul of American journalism is at stake, particularly for legacy institutions. And as a profession, we must reconcile that we are part of the very system protesters across the nation and world are pushing back against. And I'm speaking of the larger we, as there are certainly sectors of news that run counter to the oppressive systems that people of color and indigenous folks have to navigate. But we have to ask ourselves, and I'm borrowing from Dr. Glenda Wren here, who's a physician, not a journalist, and she talked about people needing to ask themselves, are they going to be sustainers, creators, deniers, facilitators, or dismantlers of systemic racism? And at the very least, news organizations have been sustainers and facilitators as we have run police mugshots full of Black and brown faces, knowing they drive page views. We have co-created with police departments, giving their reports and quotes more weight than we would the account of a woman from the community. We have disproportionately cast Black and brown folks as criminals, victims, derelicts, entertainers, or athletes for decades, helping to shape the perception that Black men in particular are dangerous. Other communities were simply ignored, their erasure, a silent and insidious facilitation of racism and white supremacy. So how will we meet this moment? How can we push forward and show the value of inclusive newsrooms that work in service of a craft to which we have all dedicated our lives? The Maynard Institute has been fighting to make American newsrooms reflect the diversity of the nation since 9 journalists of diverse backgrounds started this organization in the wake of the Kerner Commission report that called out news outlets as complicit in their inability to effectively articulate the true stories behind the unrest of the civil rights era because mainstream news organizations lacked diversity. Ironically, if you read the report today, you would wonder if any progress has been made. So much is still yet to be done, and we are navigating another kind of civil rights movement in this country that centers around health and wealth and state-sanctioned violence against people of color. The framing of our challenge within journalism has been rooted in diversity, equity, and inclusion, quite frankly, terms that don't really get at the real problem. And we at the Institute have had our own awakening. And I don't mean to imply that people working in news outlets themselves are racist. Some may be. But I'm speaking more of the generational, ambient racism that permeates these institutions and can be seen in how we approach coverage and hiring and retention. But it goes beyond who's in the building. For instance, how many Black police chiefs have been at the helm of departments that commit violence against communities of color? How many editors of color have been unable to effect the kind of sweeping change that reflects a dismantling of institutionalized racism in news organizations? One's presence is not enough to make this kind of foundational change. And for folks who think of themselves as woke, good white people who would never utter a disparaging word about or toward a person of color, you too are complicit. If you aren't actively working to dismantle systemic racism, you are a sustainer in its continuation and its effects. People of color need to heal, white people need to work to actively dismantle. That means our news organizations have to approach their work with this mission in mind. And there is a movement in the streets right now, and needs to be a movement in our newsrooms. And Tracy Powell mentioned in the last session, she wondered, is that going to happen? Is that true? Is this a moment? Or will this be lasting change? But I'm hopeful as I look around the nation and see journalists of color and their allies pushing back and calling for change. But how did we get here? So, quote, I want to read a passage from something. It says, bad policing, a flawed justice system, unscrupulous consumer credit practices, poor or inadequate housing, high unemployment, voter suppression, and other culturally embedded forms of racial discrimination all converge to propel violent upheaval on the streets of African American neighborhoods in American cities, north and south, east and west. And as Black unrest rose, inadequately trained police officers and National Guard troops entered affected neighborhoods, often worsening the violence, wrote Alice George of the Smithsonian Magazine in a look back at what led to the unrest in 1967. That sounds eerily familiar to today. And in March of 1968, the Kerner Report revealed that it was white racism and not Black anger that, quote, turned the key that unlocked urban American turmoil. And we are in turmoil now. The framework the Institute teaches, the fault lines, reveals how we all see the world through the prism of race, class, gender, generation, and geography, and sexual orientation, and how we align across these social fault lines impacts how we see the world. It's why two people can look at the same thing and come away with very different perceptions about what they just saw. I discussed this last year, as Fran mentioned, during the luncheon session at INN Days in Houston. Fault lines influences our biases, and it's why affinity bias and why people who are most like us are held in higher regard. This is why it has led to another form of bias, performance bias, which manifests itself in our news organizations. The shortcomings of people who align with your affinity bias aren't viewed as deficiencies, they're viewed as potential, while those who don't align with our biases are viewed as inexperienced and unqualified for having the same deficiencies. We talk about unconscious bias in our newsroom trainings and how people's conditioning shapes perception and causes reactions without us even thinking about it. These biases affect us all. They are mutable, but they are most likely to emerge under 4 key conditions: a lack of information existing, stress from competing tasks, time pressure, and an existing lack of diversity. Does that sound like any place all of you work? So when we look at our news organizations today, particularly those legacy institutions, we see places that have been and continue to be inhospitable to people of color. Years of neglect, years of erosion, and microaggressions have made many of these rooms toxic and unhealthy. You likely have heard about the rumblings that are going on in newsrooms across the country right now. People are fed up. They are fed up with fake standards of objectivity that would imply a person of color can't cover a George Floyd protest because they might be biased. Objectivity is the greatest lie perpetuated on journalism. And it is time to forever throw off the illusion that objectivity ever existed. It never did, and it never will. Focus on fairness, accuracy, balance, and understanding balance isn't always equal time or inches. In fact, balance may well be about rebalancing. Journalist Michelle Garcia talked about this notion of gaze, the gaze in which journalism is produced. Whose gaze is legitimate? Who gets to frame the gaze? Whose gaze is credible? The gaze of mainstream American journalism has been shaped by a vision of an institutional racism and white supremacy. And it is time for that gaze to go. Like Sauron's eye from Lord of the Rings, it needs to be snuffed out. And in the nonprofit space, while the issues may not be the same, there is still a woeful lack of diversity and inclusion. And we have talked about fault lines, biases, and microaggressions and how diversity is trust in all of our trainings. And yet something felt, even for us, as though it was missing. We began to realize it was time for us to have our own awakening. You see, the fault lines, it's a tool, a useful framework for understanding people's perception. And I think when Bob Maynard came up with it, his intent really was to be able to insert this into the stream of journalistic thinking and workflow, but downstream from the dam that holds the deep waters of systemic racism and white supremacy in the institutions our founders were seeking to integrate. Fault lines was a means to an end in many ways, and over the recent weeks, we as an institution have come to our own awakening that we can no longer walk through the rushing shallow waters of just a framework to help people understand their perceptions. We understand that to achieve the goals of the Kerner Commission, that we must instead go into the deep and join those pushing for systemic change in their newsrooms and on the streets of this country and the world. So, who are we going to be? Are we going to be sustainers, creators, deniers, facilitators, or dismantlers of systemic racism? If an organization which is dedicated to fighting for newsrooms that reflect the diversity of the nation can have our own awakening, why can't you? If young journalists who represent the future of our profession are having an awakening, why can't you? The days of tweaking around the edges and coming up with some milquetoast diversity plan, they're over. We have an opportunity to repair the damage we've caused to diverse members of our community through inaccurate portrayals, erasure, and commoditization. At a time when news outlets are pivoting to move away from ad-based revenue models to subscriber models, we have an opportunity. But don't think you can roll up with a bouquet of flowers and assume that this is going to fix the decades of shoddy coverage or no coverage at all. We need to understand, as Sarah Lomax Reese said yesterday during our Knight Foundation webinar, that in many communities, there is a deficit of trust. We were never trusted at all. Think about it. How long does it take to repair betrayal? It takes years, but it only takes an instant, one headline to destroy what you have built, especially when you're not given the benefit of the doubt because you never earned it. News organizations need to ask themselves why this even matters. Because if you can't answer that question, then whatever strategy you come up with, it won't work. Once you have answered this question for yourself, and I'm not always confident folks even know how to answer this question for themselves, we suggest that you take a page out of the book of community organizing. News outlets need to adopt organizing principles, community co-creation and listening, much like the folks who are launching the new Oakland side did when coming up with the topics to cover my city. It was an exercise in humility and of value, valuing the people they were going to serve and not viewing them through display case journalism. Our friends at Free Press, they do a wonderful job of showing how journalists can apply organizing principles and conduct community mapping exercises to better understand their neighborhoods and the people and the constituencies within them. We suggest the creation of an organizing editing position, someone steeped in journalism and community organizing, but who can connect and engage and respond and galvanize around the activism journalists engage in. And yes, we are activists. We just don't want to admit it because we think we're objective. So there's a from to exercise I want to show here real quickly that I hope I can show to you all. A moment here. I decided not to fool with these slides because they were going to distract me. And I wanted to give it to you. Okay, so here we are. So this is an important element here because it talks specifically about the need to think about function and moving towards an actual step to envision what you are trying to do. So it's a from to exercise that Fran alluded to around the table stakes work that we're doing, working on performance-driven change. And so what I want to show you here is how you can begin to envision looking at where you are and ultimately where you want to get to. So perhaps you're a news outlet that lacks diversity and inclusion at top levels of the organization. But you want to become a news outlet that reflects the diversity of the community and is equitable and inclusive. Maybe you are now a news outlet that is not trusted by large swaths of the community, but you want to become a news outlet that has built relationships and trust with diverse audiences. Going from a news outlet that has deep divisions between journalists of color and management to a news outlet that has a staff of diverse journalists who believe their life experiences are valued and rewarded by the organization. A news outlet that continues to struggle with revenue to a news outlet that has tethered audience growth and digital subscriptions to serving diverse audiences. And you notice I'm being explicit about saying audiences, not underserved communities. A news outlet that says it values DEI to a news outlet with a clear plan to diversify and empower its staff and understand how doing so contributes to sustainability. This exercise is about envisioning the world you wish to see. It's about acknowledging where you are at this moment and thinking explicitly about where you need to get to. It's about getting real with where you are with your employees, your coverage, your community, and framing the place you want to get to and why. And from there, you would take those twos from to and create strategies and specific tactics to get where you need to go. Structural change is incremental and it requires discipline and dedication to get there. But perhaps more importantly, it requires a reason. What is it that I have been trying to get at during this conversation, and why does it matter? And I can't answer that for you. I know why it matters to me. It's life or death. It's life or death for my son, who I worry about every day because he's been cast in the media as dangerous. It's life or death for Black mothers I know who have reconciled the fact that from the day their sons were born, they might not make it. I don't know why it matters to you. It matters to me because I live Black every day, and I love living Black, by the way. I don't get a day off from being Black, not that I would want one. White folks don't have to think about what it means to be white, except perhaps right now, at this moment, after seeing the life pressed out of George Floyd. Maybe you are. I'm not objective, and I never was and I never will be. And in the eyes of some, like the inept leadership at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, that might disqualify me from covering a story related to being Black in this struggle. And how ridiculous does that sound? By that logic, white folks shouldn't be able to cover anything. And how outrageous is that? I'm not here to assuage concerns or to make folks feel better about where we stand at this moment in our nation's history. The fact of the matter is the eyes of our journalistic ancestors are upon us. The time has come to begin the long journey of healing and repairing our nation and our craft. Philanthropic institutions that fund journalism organizations have their own reconciling to do as well. The days of soft-shoeing grants to outlets or organizations that aren't explicit about equity and inclusion needs to stop. Foundations that ignore their own role in sustaining systemic racism through the grants they award and what they let slide are sustainers and facilitators. Organizations led by people of color win less grant money and are trusted less to make decisions about how to spend those funds than groups with white leaders, this according to a May 20th, 2020 article that appeared in the Chronicle of Philanthropy. Less money, more restrictions. It sounds structural to me. So there is a reckoning that needs to happen within these halls and these institutions, but where will the outrage come from? There is a massive power imbalance at play because the very institutions that are being discriminated against are the very institutions that need the support from foundations. You could argue that it's almost like organizational sharecropping. I say this at some peril to myself and my organization, a small nonprofit that relies on the support of philanthropic institutions that may frown on being called out as sustainers of institutional racism. But you know what? Black people are being killed. Brown people are being slain. Indigenous and trans folks are being murdered. Our Asian brothers and sisters are being targeted. Protesters are putting their lives on the line in the streets to make this case. Journalists and newsrooms are putting their careers on the line to call for change. And I'll be damned if I won't rest my reputation and the legacy of our founders on the doorstep of history to support them. It's what Dory Maynard would do. It's what her father, Bob Maynard, would do before her. journalism can play, and it must play, a vital role at this time and in the coverage of this movement for justice and equity. Like America's ideals, our ideals are magnificent, but are rarely applied equitably. Hold truth to power. Give voice to the voiceless. If your mother says she loves you, check it out. Well, maybe not that one. So let's take this opportunity to be real, to reconcile our complicity and redesign a journalism ecosystem and philanthropic community that embodies the best in all of us, for all of us. On behalf of my co-executive director, Evelyn Sue, and the mighty Maynard Institute team, I thank you for the time, and I'm looking forward to engaging in questions and a dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Martin. Everyone, we're going to open up to questions now, so please put your questions in the chat. I'm Sarah Shariari from INN, and we will be relaying questions over to Martin. Martin, you're getting tons of thank yous for your wonderful talk and the ideas that you've shared with us. We have a question for you. What are your thoughts on white leaders stepping down to make room for new Black, Indigenous, and people of color in leadership?
It's an interesting question. I mean, I never want to see good people, but this is something, to have to step away or to leave an organization, seeing people resign over mistakes that happen. But I think there is, how do you make room for folks when you can't just hire? What is the answer there? I was talking to a colleague yesterday who was talking about, should white leaders at higher levels donate a portion of their salary to be able to then create positions, right, that otherwise wouldn't be there. So I don't, because it's real life, right? Folks have families, folks have things that they need to pay for. So yeah, maybe theoretically, yes, white people step aside and let the Black folks run things. And let the Black women run things, right? Let the women of color run things. Just let women run things for a while. Let the dudes sit down. So I'm all for that. But I don't know that I have a great answer for that. I think in theory, people stepping aside to make way for others is great. How it would work in actuality, I'm not sure.
Thank you. We have a question from Rob who's asking, what is the best way to recruit people of color to fill positions?
Well, first and foremost, make organizations hospitable to want to be in. One of the things that really stands out to me is how, particularly for legacy news organizations, there's a lot of folks in the nonprofit space who sort of created things that are new. They're not necessarily old. They might be 5 years old or 3 years. They don't have the legacy challenges. They have problems, but they don't, in some of these newspapers across the country, these have been really challenging places to work for folks. And I think what you are seeing now in some of these insurrections within newsrooms is a generational pushback on these kind of environments that those of us who are Gen Xers and the boomers before us sort of got in and just were like, we're just going to power ahead, right? They walk through fire to get where they are, to become editors, become managing editors, editors in chief. And, but now, and navigated some really challenging environments. And now the young folks are saying, we're not doing that. It's time to be done. And I appreciate that immensely. So I think if you want to recruit, you actually have to, we have to think structurally at this point. It's not about diversity. Diversity without equity, without inclusion is window dressing. And so you have to think about how bringing in creating an inclusive culture, that it is a part of the work you do. So if you're talking to me about how do I get journalists of color, I would say, how are you going to change your organizations to make a multicultural, multiracial, multi-generational staff? How is that going to contribute to your growth and sustainability? Why does that matter? And how does it help you? You have to ask at that level. The walking through the shallow streams of diversity programs is not enough.
Thank you. This is something that we've talked about a lot. You know, there's a lot of aspiration to create more diverse, equitable, and inclusive newsrooms, but not that many newsrooms have actual actionable policies and templates.
Right.
We have a question from Kerry Mitchell. Are there any newsrooms with equity and inclusion policies that you recommend?
I wouldn't say anyone's doing it fantastically. There are sort of bright spots in places. So, I worked at CIR for a number of years running their Review Fellowship program. And there you had leadership and Krista Scharfenberg, who cared about diversity explicitly, created diverse hiring committees, which then led to the hiring of Matt Thompson and having a completely diverse pool of finalists for this editor-in-chief position. That being said, but it hasn't been a utopia in that organization either, even with the commitment to diversity that has been there. Our friends at Cal Matters, I think, have around 40% diversity in their staff, but very homogenous at the upper echelons. So 40% is above industry standard by far, but they're operating in a state that's 60% people of color. So there's really no place. The good news is no one's really doing it right. So you're not in horrible company. The bad news is nobody's doing it right. So I think that's why this moment is so essential, thinking at a foundational level and looking at diversity, equity, and inclusion, not as a nice to have, not as something, oh goodness, I wish we could do this, but thinking, how does this actually tether itself to our ability to survive in a country that is rapidly browning, rapidly changing, has 6 generations alive at one time and 4 generations in our newsrooms. So this is a business imperative. Now, corporate America has sort of, I wouldn't say is always executed effectively on this, but in many ways is considerably further along than journalism because they're about trying to make that money. And so they understand, well, if this is about making money, journalists, we have, issues with money. At least some of us do. So we haven't understood the importance of it and connected it to surviving. And I think that's because we also have to reconcile the institutional racism that exists in news organizations. And if we can come at it from that perspective, then I believe this could be a really critical moment for change.
Thank you. Martin, we've talked so much about bias, lack of bias, who gets to define what that is. That's a really lively conversation right now. Can you talk a little bit more about these instances we've seen of particularly African-American journalists being sort of cast as inherently biased and unable to cover protests by editors? Do you see change on that front now in the increasing awareness?
Well, yeah, I don't want to make one other point. When I say that no one's doing diversity right, I want to point out that that's in largely mainstream news organizations. If in other places, I'm sure there are places where they're doing diversity right. And what we need to do is figure out where other places are, where it's happening correctly, maybe in niche publications and so on and so forth, and look at the models that are working elsewhere and bring them to other places. I don't want to make it sound like no one's getting it right anywhere. To answer the question about bias, I was on a panel about Alexis Johnson at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette when she posted a tweet of these photos and says, look at these terrible looters, but it was just a tongue-in-cheek tweet that was actually the aftermath of a concert. And then the leadership at the publication said that, well, then even the hint of bias could be problematic. Number one, the tweet was innocuous. And number two, this speaks to why inclusion is not present in news organizations. Because the reality is journalists of color who have had to step into news organizations have had to conform. There's been an expectation that they would then basically become journalists of no color, of no background, and just begin to continue to do the journalism from the gaze, as Michelle Garcia so eloquently said, of the existing news organizational culture. That's not inclusion. That's like taking your content and just translating it into Spanish and thinking that that's serving the Hispanic community. So I do think that I don't know to what extent this will ultimately forever be cast aside, but it needs to be moved aside. There needs to be an understanding that who people are, what they bring, their life experiences matter, and they are important components to what they bring to the journalistic process, to how they think about stories, how they reflect what they have experienced in their lives. It doesn't make them biased, it makes them human. And so I'm tired of this notion of sort of this blank slate walking into a room and telling the story as though how you align across your fault lines doesn't completely color how you see the world and how you see sources and people and an angle and legitimacy. Of course it does. And it's part of the reason why we're not trusted. Sally Lehrman in the Trust Project talked about the 8 core indicators of trustworthy content, and among them is diverse voices. And so if news organizations, and it's also listed in its best practices. So this is essential. Diversity is a best practice. It's not a nice to have.
Thank you. We also have a couple questions about funding, particularly, could you share a positive interaction with a funder around diversity and equity concerns? Are any funders doing this right at this moment? And I'll also point out that one of our panelists today is Tracy Powell from Borealis. And if you have any questions about the Racial Equity and Journalism Fund, you can certainly reach out to her. But Martin, we'd love to hear your thoughts on funding and equity.
Yeah, I mean, we're fortunate at the Institute because, I mean, you look at the Knight Foundation now, which has like one of the most diverse-led grant-making teams I think I've ever seen, with Paul Chung and Karen Runlett and Lashara Bunting, a number of Maynard graduates, I'll point out, but we ain't sliding them nothing under the table. They work us harder to get them dollars. And then you have, Jennifer Preston, who's a real advocate, and I think has had her own awakening around these issues as well. And that's like, so having that mix of people who get it is critical. Democracy Fund has also been a place that has shown itself to really care deeply and been extremely intentional about how they are going to approach grant making. And the team there has been fantastic. Paul Waters now moved on to another thing, but our person, Leah Trusty and Josh Stearns. I mean, these are good folks who care deeply about these issues. Of course, Ford Foundation with Farai today. I mean, having someone like Farai in that position makes a huge difference. So people who get it. So I think, those 3 foundations in particular stand out to me, that because they have, but it's also perilous when you start naming funders. Then I feel like, okay, I've got to name all, right? But I think having diversity in the philanthropic space and having those folks have agency is vital, because we know philanthropies, there's systemic they're made up of human beings too. So of course there's going to be systemic racism and bias in them. It's not a criticism, it's just real. So just be real about it. The places that we have, but I will tell you this, the places that we have tended to have the most success are places where there are people of color, where that we don't have to step up and prove ourselves. Like there's this already, connection. There isn't these biases that naturally exist. Whereas oftentimes with other program officers, it feels like I'm having to make a case and they don't necessarily even know why I'm having to make an extra case, but it's just there. So I think foundations themselves need to think about their own grant making and their own training, and how they can go about rethinking their own approach and checking their own biases.
Thank you so much, Martin. And thank you to everybody who's leaving your questions. It's just breaking my heart that we can't get to all of your questions. And I think I see a real hunger for more conversations with Martin, and we will do everything we can to make that happen. Martin, thank you. I've had the amazing opportunity to hear from you many times over the last few weeks, and it has been just extraordinary to learn from you. And I really appreciate you, and thank you for talking with us. And everybody on our chat feed is also thanking you for being so honest and open and thoughtful and sharing your time with us so generously. So thank you. We appreciate you.
Well, thank you. I appreciate all of you. Thank you to INN and to all my good folks at home right now. Take good care of yourselves. Stay safe, stay positive, and test negative.